So thank you for taking some time in your afternoon to join us and remember Will. The first thing I want to do is actually thank the SMS, because they reached out to me and some of Will's other colleagues and students, after Will passed away, with this notion of recognizing Will and acknowledging that this annual meeting wouldn't be until September, and wanting to do something beforehand too. So I think many of you have probably seen or joined the virtual event, and we've chosen an event now that we'll try and keep to half an hour to complement that. So in the virtual event, we wanted to celebrate Will and really the scope of activities that he did as an academic. So not so much focusing on his scholarship, but sides of Will that maybe not everybody saw. Will as a teacher, Will as a service contributor, Will, being engaged with the business community and public policy. And so that's what we focused on there. And tonight we'd like to switch gears a little bit and again focus on his scholarship. And all of us are Will's co-authors and former students. And I have to say, we're some of his earlier students. So we certainly can't reflect his interaction with everybody. At the same time, I think we counted, and there's probably 70-some doctoral students that Will was involved with. So again, we're only a snapshot of that. Nevertheless, I think because we've known Will for a long time and being his co-authors, I hope we can do a sufficient job focusing on the evolution of Will's contributions, and especially the themes, and that will be one of the highlights. And just to prompt, one of the things that I want to talk about is, all of us feel very strongly when we think about our work with Will, is that not only was Will an important voice and contributor in all of that, but we feel that all of our voices were included in these papers too. And so I don't think anybody would confuse us for being carbon copies of each other. And I think that that's really another reflection of us and Will and his mentorship. So I want to move on, but I will start with just a very quick story. And this was what it was like to work with Will, especially on a paper. So Will was focused. And so if you worked with Will for a distance, you'd send him something and sometimes think about, okay, maybe he'll get back to me tomorrow, and in half an hour there'd be something in your inbox. But as focused as it was working with Will from a distance, there was nothing quite like showing up and working one-on-one with Will. I see Laurence smiling here. So it wouldn't be unusual. You'd show up to his office, and I'm thinking back in the Michigan days, and you'd sit there and you'd talk for a little while, and then there were two desks. And Will would sit at his desk with a computer and focus that, and you'd sit at the other desk on a computer and focus on that. You'd be sort of back to back, and you wouldn't talk, but you'd work. And so you'd work the whole time, and then I found out very quickly that, Will was so focused, he wouldn't break for lunch. So he'd be working away, and at some point it's like, okay, I can't do this anymore, I have to go for lunch. So I'd go for lunch, I'd come back, we'd do the same thing. And I have to admit, at the end of the day, I swear, the guy never ate anything. And quite frankly, unless he did it when I was gone, I don't think he went to the bathroom. So having said that little vignette about sort of Will and how he did things, let's turn to his scholarship. So let me invite Xavier to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Myles, and welcome all. All right, it works. Whether and when. This is the lead of the title of Will's first major publication. A paper that came out was accepted, as best we can tell, less than 4 years after he had started his PhD, and true to Will's legendary work ethic, around the time that he graduated as well with that same PhD. Whether and when. Two individually rather simple, if not trivial sounding questions that, when taken in combinations, allowed Will to see trade-offs and contrasts that otherwise would not be possible to see. Why those trade-offs? Because the type of universes that Will mostly studied and made sense of consisted of firms facing uncertain and contested business opportunities amidst resource constraints and some level of bounded rationality. It follows from there, when combined with a brilliant idea that Will operationalized from his supervisor, David Teese, pertaining to the importance of complementary assets for capturing value from innovation, that he was able in his early work, focusing on the decisions to enter into various subfields of an emerging technology, his early context being digital medical equipment, to shed unusual, really exceptional light, if you read back those papers, onto the trade-offs that firms faced about whether and when to enter, whether and when to exit various markets. With this early work, for instance, he showed that while firms not possessing complementary assets face distinct potential disadvantages and trade-offs, those that possessed complementary assets were not free of those trade-offs. They were just different trade-offs, making sense of which was important for both sets of firms. With this, within a few years, Will had covered the world of entry, exit, competing risks, essentially the basic toolkit or questions of an evolutionary strategist, and went on to study further combinations of those questions. In some of his early work with Kulwant, for instance, he tackled the question of who or with whom and when to enter various technological subfields and with what consequences. In later years yet, where in technological space to enter and when, and the trade-offs involved therein were the basis of some of his insights. Reading Will's early work and some of the editorial work that he published on this topic with the likes of Rebecca Henderson and Anita McGahan is a lesson in how his deep commitment and passion about evolutionary perspectives, and in particular evolutionary economics, allowed him to shed lights on phenomena about technologies but also about routines, and how he understood and shed fresh light on classical questions in transaction cost economics to go beyond make and buy to study entry and exit in particular. With this, and this is on some level even more remarkable for the pace at which this will now come, at the same time almost, but very soon thereafter, Will went on to simultaneously zoom in and zoom out of his initial level of interest in business units and their entries and exit. Zooming in, considering, again in some early work with Kulwant, how the entry and exit into a particular technological subfield or product market was related with what could be happening elsewhere in the organization, including in what would have been labeled in those days the core business. Considering, and here this next paper took a little while longer by Will's standards to get published because he committed a minor transgression relative to the standards of the day, considering that beyond looking at the entry and exit of individual businesses, it was worthwhile and very insightful to study how technologies, the underlying routines and capabilities, this indeed is an early groundbreaking work in dynamic capabilities, would endure in an industry independent of the entry and exit of individual businesses via processes such as acquisitions and what we might nowadays call spin-outs, for instance. Later on, in a work with Charlie Williams, he would study how the structure and setup of the organization would lens the attention of the decision makers and therefore affect, again, how the inside the organization would affect those same decisions that he'd been interested in all along. And in later year yet, how that would affect, in work with Nell Dutt, how that would affect the processing of internal and, but also importantly, external signals about the viability and importance of various technologies. At the same time, Will was zooming out in a manner that, to the international business scholar that I was remarkable. In some of his work with Myles and Bernie Young, he took on the issue of the consequences of international expansion and its determinants. At the time, the literature was well settled on explanations essentially from transaction cost economics, which were full of insights and quite rigorous, but that could be looked at differently when studying change and the effect of change. Thereby, the where and the when were coming together in a way that gave us new insights. Amongst those insights was that because we could study the when as well as the where, we could study the effects of learning, not only learning at the level of the individual firm experientially, but also what we would nowadays call vicarious learning. And therefore, another tool was added to Will's set of concepts. In later work yet, with Anand Swaminathan, he conceptualized international expansion not at the feet or decisions of an individual firm, but effectively as a, if not coordinated, at least collective process of expansion of its web of firms with related interests and dependencies, and how that in turn shed light on the whether, the when, and the where of international expansion. And furthermore, in later work yet with Wilbur Chang, how that would in turn lead to influences institutionally and economically for the firms around those businesses. With this, Will had taken what I would consider the next step in his career, and a flowering of research would follow, but for that, I turn it over to Laurence. Thank you.
Thank you, Myles, for organizing this session. Thank you, Xavier. As Xavier just highlighted, Will really pushed the frontiers of our collective knowledge on the evolution of firms and how firms struggle with inertia and change at the same time. And to study how firms would change, Will started to take a deeper dive into how capability were configured. And so as a result, he used different theoretical lenses. So Xavier mentioned that he started really rooted in the evolutionary economics and the transaction cost economics. And then as he moved to understand how a firm would acquire and reconfigure their capability and resources, he would use the dynamic capabilities, the org learning lenses. So one core research question that drove Will's research agenda was the following ones. It was really how do firms acquire and redeploy the resources and capabilities they need to compete in changing competitive environments, with a specific interest in the inter-organizational modes of change, such as M&As, acquisition, licensing. For this session today, I did review the set of study on this topic by Will and his co-author. I decided to narrow down this review to what he published in SMJ, where he already covered so much ground. So the selected sample I will briefly present is not exhaustive, but will give you an appreciation of his invaluable contribution to the stream of research on business dynamics and reconfiguration. So one important empirical phenomenon in the reconfiguration research stream was mergers and acquisitions. So in the 80s and 90s, finance and strategy scholars had examined acquisition drivers and performance. And in the field of strategy, we had an influential group of scholars who focused on the performance of related versus unrelated acquisitions, mainly through event study, trying to unpack the different sources of synergistic value creation. Will and his co-author shifted the focus of M&A analysis from the market to the firm's resources and capabilities. They took a much more dynamic view of M&A, with M&A being viewed as a way of adding, recombining, redeploying resources. And one key implication of this shift of analysis to the firm's resources at the empirical level was to examine what would happen to the resources of the merging firms following the acquisition, whether these resources would be further developed, redeployed to or from target, whether they would be recombined within internal units or newly acquired unit, restructured, divested. Another implication of this shift of analysis was to approach M&A within the broader landscape of the firm's corporate development activities and to explore whether and when M&A would be the most effective mode of change compared to alternative modes such as internal development, licensing, or alliances. In this field, in this stream of research on reconfiguration, another key phenomenon that we'll study for 3 decades was the inter-firm resource exchanges, redeployment, and learning through various forms of collaboration. Again, with collaboration between firms playing an essential evolutionary role in terms of diffusions of capability within and across industries. Again, here you can see a timeline that covers 3 decades of Will's research on alliances, which involved a very rich set of empirical setting and scholars based in North America, Asia, and Europe. Yeah. And so I want to stress here a few lines of investigation that Will and his co-authors pursue that I found particularly interesting for our research community. The first line of investigation was to explore the interplay between external discontinuities, shock, and alliance dynamics, and what it would mean in terms of coordination cost and the adaptability of the alliance partners based on the type of turbulence they were facing. The second line explored the interplay between alliances and more independent modes of change, such as internal development, and this need for parallel concurrent mode of sourcing. And in the third line of exploration, Will and his co-authors integrated multiple levels of reconfiguration, a kind of cascade of reconfiguration processes, the reconfiguration of the resources themselves, the reconfiguration of the alliance venture, whether they would be shut down, taken over, restructured, and the reconfiguration of the firm's alliance portfolio. A last empirical domain of exploration I would like to highlight here was the divestiture piece. So far, M&As and divestitures had been studied as separate research streams, in the context of M&A, divestiture was mainly used as a proxy for acquisition failure. And Will and his co-author took a more positive and dynamic view of divestiture along 3 key dimensions. They consider resource redeployment and divestiture following M&A as part of a common process of business reconfiguration, going hand in hand. They also view divestiture as reducing constraint to changing a firm's resource base, which could be part of a virtuous cycle for high-performing firms. And Will and co-author also explain the relationship between the institutional environment, particularly in the context of the emerging market, such as the degree of market development, and the extent to which firms would engage in reconfiguration activities to grow or retrench, like the piece in the Global Strategy Journal. At a more anecdotal level, when Samina and I were assembling the SMJ special virtual issue on reconfiguration a few years ago, we had to select the most influential SMJ papers on reconfiguration, and it was challenging for us to decide which papers from Will to include, because the entire special issue could have been made of Will's paper. So we only pick 4 of his papers among the 14 influential papers we selected for this special issue. So just to conclude, I think we are very thankful for Will's enormous contribution and his relentless dedication to our research community and this field of research. So thank you, and I will now pass it over to Kulwant.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to conclude this section by doing two things. First, by presenting an overview of his recent work, what Will has been working on in recent times, which we call solving the organizational puzzle of innovation, institutions, and expansion. Clearly a fairly loose overview of the many things he was working on. But recent work has emphasized innovation more than he did previously, and innovation in interesting contexts, interesting as in often being international. All four of these papers, for example, were in emerging economy contexts. And of course, in that when you talk about emerging economies, institutions matter. And Will has become, in our view, more of an institutionalist in recent times. In recent times. The issue of expansion is something Will has always worked on, right from his early days, expansion across borders. And this sort of emphasizes something. While his work has been fresh, lots of new issues, the roots of his recent work are the same as way back in his origins. Right from the start, Will paid attention to innovation, although in his early work it was more a question of technology access and accessing resources and capabilities. In his early days, he drew from Williamson's institutional economics, and now he's complemented that with a broader perspective. And crossing borders was the context of many of the issues he studied in his early work. We want to go beyond Will's research contributions through the content of this work to try and talk a bit about his contributions as a person and how he did his research. So what we're going to do, talk about contributions from his approach and what he did, Will as the man, right? And I would say one of the things he taught us is the strength of a pragmatic approach to doing research. Now, we've just seen the depth and breadth of Will's research, and there's no question that, of his theoretical contributions. So this is not a call for atheoretical research, right? It's recognizing that Will saw research as a complex activity, and that our research couldn't produce complete answers. And therefore, he often took a very pragmatic approach. One of those his basic approach was to ask interesting questions and then to undertake evidence-based research, evidence-based investigation. When necessary, integrate cross-disciplinary research. Again, I want to be careful. This is not a call for shortcuts and, combining theories when reviewers had divergent views. Will did not work that way. But when necessary and when useful, and based on fundamental theoretical reasons, combine different perspectives to answer the questions. He often illustrated this by suggesting that our work was somewhat like plumbing. If you saw a leak, would you just use one tool or would you use all of them to solve the problem? And he often suggested that using multiple theories was a good thing to do. I'm also sure if that Will took up plumbing, he would have changed the dynamics and the technology of that industry overnight. I think one of the key attributes that Will had was Will was a disciplined thinker. He would not be swayed by opinion or by casual empiricism. He brought discipline to everything he did. And this, I think, certainly conveyed to all of us, his students and co-authors, but probably has had lasting impact. Will was also an empiricist. I emphasize also because his theoretically driven contributions. But he loved working with data, right? Data was his big thing. He had fun with data when When, I suffered, he seemed to be enjoying that pain. His view was data can illuminate theory, right? It's not just a context for testing or the context of your research. Rich data, of course, is ideal, but he worked around that, recognizing that data is always incomplete and that even messy, difficult data has stories to tell. Next, and this may seem obvious to all of us now, the value of talking to managers. But this was something Will did right from the start. And not just obviously to find interesting questions that managers can identify, but I think Will thought strongly that we could help managers with our theories, something that I think all of us should bear in mind. And perhaps the last point, Will was proud of his students and co-authors. And I think if we asked him, what do you think, how do you think you contributed most to research? I think he would say this, that he would point to his work with his students and his co-authors and say, that's it. I think he was the ideal co-author. He never lent his name to anything. If he agreed to participate, he would be fully committed, would do more than his share. At the same time, like Myles pointed out earlier, the co-authors had a voice, and the papers you saw earlier reflected both their voice and what Will thought. I put a list of items there, the importance of research being meaningful, interesting, relevant, and the importance of doing things right. Will was inclusive, fair, generous, and a good person and colleague. This sounds like a routine claim. At sessions like this, you get sentimental and you claim a lot of positive qualities. None of this is over-claiming for Will. This is who he was. And I think by inculcating these values to his students and colleagues, he had a major positive impact. If I can end on just this one point, I used to say that there is no better man than Will in all of academia. I believe that to be true. Will would have no regard for that claim. He had no interest in such claims. But then he would notice that's a testable hypothesis. And he would quickly, I think, grab a piece of paper, sit down and start charting and test out how in an organizational context this could lead to some interesting findings. So I think we all miss Will greatly. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so once again, thank you all for sharing your time and giving us a chance to share our interactions with Will and our thoughts of how he's contributed to the field. So thank you. I'll remind you that there is a reception in 15 minutes, and so please go there and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.